everyone. Thank you all for attending our webinar. I am Robin Keller, an attorney in Connecticut. My practice is focused on special education law and other educational issues. My co-presenter today is Gerri.Fleming, a well-known and very respected special education advocate. Gerri has an incredible knowledge of appropriate assessments and evaluations of children and how to measure their access to education. Acting as moderator during the question and answer period is Jen Steiner, legal administrator for Keller Law and advocate in training. Please use the link below for questions. Only Jen will see the questions. Check anonymous, an option that you have, if you do not want your identity revealed for any reason. Please ask questions that will preserve the identity of your child, yet specific to the issue you are attempting to resolve. Here's the disclaimer that I have to say. This webinar contains legal information only and should not be construed as legal advice specific to any parent or child situation. This webinar is not a legal consultation and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. We will be recording this webinar, therefore, again, please do not ask specific questions that would reveal the identity of your child's school, or providers' names. With that, let's get started. Next slide, please. The slide before, please, under parental rights. Terrific. Parents, before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to describe the purpose and goals of this webinar. The purpose is to prepare you as a parent as to what your rights are during the distance learning, and equally as important, for that glorious day in the future when your child has entered her school building again and you are sitting down for your first PPT, post-distance learning. We don't know if that will be in 3 months, 6 months from now, or when, but in either case, and this is in large caps, you will be the primary evaluator and reporter for your child, not the regular ed teacher, not the special ed teacher, and not the special providers. You. Those sitting around the table may know very little about your child and may not have even ever met her. You are the only one who can review with them how your child has accessed her education opportunities over the distance learning period. Gerri will share with you explicit methodologies on how to be an effective primary evaluator so your child's new team will have the knowledge on where to begin school-based instruction again. Our goal is to empower you to be the most well-informed member of your child's planning and placement team. The next couple of slides are very quickly going to review parental rights under the federal law Individuals with Disability Education Act, known as IDEA. It is the federal engine that drives state and local school district delivery of services. I want you all to understand the rights your child and our children are entitled to before we discuss any change in delivery of those services during school closures. Next slide, please. So this is the good news. Your rights have not changed during distance learning at all. The only way your rights can change is through an act of Congress. We were nervous waiting for Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos' recommendations as far as waivers that she was to make to Congress under the CARES Act. Those came out last night, and we are thrilled that she did not make any recommendations that would create a waiver or limit your rights under IDEA. She, in fact, expanded birth to 3 Part C funding beyond the age of 3 years. Next slide, please. Let's first discuss entitlement and what that means. Entitlement, if your child has a suspected disability or has been identified as one needing special education and related services, there are no ifs, ands, and buts on whether the IEP education, services, and modifications are to be delivered. It is the law and only can be changed by an act of Congress or parental consent. The analogy I often give is Social Security. When the time comes for me to collect Social Security, it is not an option of the government whether or not to give me that Social Security. I am entitled to it. I am entitled to receive that monthly check. I don't have to ask the government on a monthly basis to please give me my retirement benefits or to please not change that amount unilaterally without my consent or Congress's consent. That is what the entitlement is under IDEA. Now, there are six principles of under the IDEA Act, and that's what I'm calling the pre-pandemic entitlements. Those have not changed. The delivery of a lot of them will have changed. The first one is a free appropriate education. What that is what is appropriate for a child under the circumstances. What is their cognitive ability? What is their achievement level? Is it lower than cognitive? Why? Is it due to a disability that needs a service or specialized education to prevent regression? Is it due to behavior that is interfering with the child accessing their education? Let's first review these principles again very quickly. That the delivery of the child during distance learning is different than when school doors were open. Next slide, please. Instead of talking about a free, appropriate public education, I'm going to start using the alphabet soup of FAPE. And a big part of FAPE is evaluations. It is a huge part in determining how a child should receive a fair and appropriate public education. Evaluations will indicate whether a child's disability is adversely impacting their access to education and whether the child needs specially designed instruction. An IEP or an individualized educational plan. Evaluations, and this is the part that creates the tension during distance learning, must be done by individuals qualified to give the evaluations and interpret the results. This creates a dilemma during school closures. Next slide, please. These are the sections of the individualized education plan when your child has been identified to receive special education services. Gerri will be reviewing several of these sections and how you can evaluate the much needed information. What's important to know, in my humble opinion, is that an IEP is not subjective, not one part of it. It is meant to be objective. It is an objective, organic document based on current data of your child's ability as compared to the standardized norms of children her age. From the evaluations done to determine present levels of performance, the team develops measurable goals and objectives and determines what accommodations and specialized instructions are necessary. Next slide, please. Planning and placement teams are the engine that drives the IEP, the individualized education plan. The team reviews objective, measurable data and may make the determination that the child is not making progress towards mastering their goals and objectives, or that the behavior of the child or social emotional factors not previously addressed are interfering with the child, creating the need for a change in goals and objectives. I'm not going to read what's on the slide, but you can see the various reasons for why you would have a planning and placement team meeting. Next slide, please. Again, this is a repeat, but I really want to make this point that as I previously discussed, all of your previous rights are intact. the school district cannot make unilateral changes to your child's educational plan. Let's discuss what has altered since school closures. Next slide, please. These are the areas that have most been impacted by school closures and distance learning. Any school district that offers distance learning must offer that learning on an equitable basis. Your child should not fall further behind than his peers during this time of distance learning. There are needs to be given the tools and accommodations so he can access his education. All his specialized instruction and services must continue through the delivery. They must continue, although the delivery will certainly have changed for many of them. Under current issues, the first one is waivers that I want to discuss. You don't have to sign a waiver for your child to access their education. Why? As we talked about before, it is a right. It is an entitlement. What you may be asked to do on a limited basis is sign waivers that you will not disclose information about other children that you may observe. That is a privacy issue, and makes sense as far as you would not want other parents who are observing a classroom Zoom meeting to report on your child having a meltdown. Yet on the other hand, there are many who disagree that that's even necessary because you do know who is in your child's class. You do have school directories and information. However, if you are asked to sign any waiver, it should really only be for the privacy issues. You do not have to sign a waiver in order for your child to access their education. The IEP delivery of services. It will not be the same as pre-March 15th. March 15th is just the date I'm going to use during this webinar as to when distance learning began. Physical therapy is an example. While a physical therapist cannot come to your house during distancing, an IEP could be revised to include, as an additional service, parent training. So you can confer with the physical therapist on how to deliver the exercises that the physical therapist was implementing in the school classroom. But remember, services cannot be legally reduced just because of the distance learning environment. Remember, your child services are an entitlement. Next slide, please. Another area that's changed, of course, in the same way, if parent training is necessary, then that should be added. If the paraprofessionals, if your child had access to a paraprofessional or a BCBA, you need to understand the role that each provider served prior to the distance learning. It's important for you to understand that so you can understand what that provider, that support staff can still provide through a distance period in which they cannot. Next slide, please. PPTs definitely are to be held during distance learning. Early on, some of the first State Department of Education guidance, anticipating that school would only be closed for 2 weeks, allowed districts to decide whether PPTs would be held. No more. Further guidance and later guidance said that depending on an issue, PPTs are to be held or may not need to be held in an amendment to an existing IEP implemented. By the way, I did not mention, but we will provide to all of you, upon request, we have your email addresses, these slides as well as the documents that Jerry is going to provide. Next slide, please. The one type of PPT that cannot be delayed until the start of the school year are transitional PPTs. These are for children who are entering the 18 to 21-year-old program or are exiting from that program. There is no fall period for them. They are done with the program they are in. So it must be planned now during this academic year. Next slide, please. Extended school year. Even though distance learning is occurring right now, extended school year needs to be determined by PPTs. If your child's current IEP does not designate whether ESY is necessary for this upcoming summer, you need to request a PPT to determine the need. ESY is offered to some, but not all, special ed children for very specific reasons. It is not to be used, and there has been guidance on this, to make up on a compensatory education basis for any missed services that occurred through distance learning. It is not to be summer school. ESY goals and objectives have not changed at all. And they are, will the child lose critical skills, and will it take him an inordinate time to catch up and to regain those skills? ESY purpose remains the same. Next slide, please. FERPA is the Federal Educational Records Privacy Act. There was a question during distance learning because of limited access to school buildings, whether FERPA 10-day requirement for production would be extended. It has not been extended. Again, that would take a congressional act to do that. So if you need access to your children's records and have never requested them before, you may want to request them in light with what Gerri is going to teach you about present levels of performance. Be reasonable, though, in understanding that while many records are online, and if your child has an IEP, there is something called an IEP repository that will have all your child's documents in there, special ed documents, but certain documents that might be kept in the school building may not be accessible or may take longer than 10 days. Next slide, please. I don't want to read this slide, but to advise that the execution of procedural rights right now is changing and on a frequent basis. Right now, mediations are being held virtually, and they're being very successfully held. And whereas 2 weeks ago, there wasn't a chance that due process hearings would be held during the distance learning period, the State Department of Education is taking steps through Microsoft Teams and other platforms to be able to possibly proceed with due process hearings. Under the governor's executive order, I believe it was on April 8th, he gave a 90-day extension for all administrative hearings, or an up to 90-day extension. So that would mean till July 8th. But we're hopeful that through on a virtual basis, we can proceed with all the due process rights. Next slide, please. This is another slide that I'm not going to read all the details on, but do want you to know that this information is available to you on the state website whenever there is an updated guidance. But even better is that I recommend that you access the website seekct.com. That's SEEKCT.com. Seek is an organization that provides a voice to Connecticut parents. It's an organization made up of parents, attorneys, and advocates. And they provide up-to-the-minute information as well and have terrific webinars that are available on Thursday nights. And I highly recommend that you check them out. With that, I would like to pass the presentation on to Gerri.
Thank you, Robin and Jen. Welcome, everybody. For my portion of the presentation, I'm going to discuss parental empowerment. The biggest lesson that I have learned as an advocate is that knowledge gives us power. Next slide. During a recent webinar, Brian Klimkowitz, who is Connecticut's Bureau Chief for Special Education, he commented that during school closure, parents are now the primary evaluator. This is wonderful news for us. Next slide. Truer words have not been spoken. Because of the school closures, you as parents have assumed many new roles on top of your other responsibilities. You are perhaps your child's teacher or special education teacher or related service provider or paraprofessional. But perhaps your most important educational role is this. Next slide. The role of the PPT moderator. You have always been the expert on your child, but now you have the inside scoop on how your child has been responding to distance learning. And some of the information that you have learned may be different to what the school has told you about your child's particular skill level. If you have a PPT meeting during the closure, and chances are you will, you should moderate or run the PPT meeting. How do you do this though? Here are some things you need to know to run a productive meeting. Next slide. First, you have to create an agenda. What do you need to discuss? You want to give parameters to the meeting. Here is a sample of some possible topics to be discussed. You want to send a list of the topics that you want to discuss to the school team in advance of the PPT meeting so they know what you want to cover during the meeting. Next slide. Here is the same agenda from the previous page, only this one includes the information you might possibly want to share with the team in the meeting. For example, the first bullet point. Every PPT meeting starts with an update of the student. You should point out any possible issues that you're having with assignment completion, a lack of engagement, the failure to make progress, regression, an inability for your child to understand what they're attempting to teach him. If you have challenges with technology, you need to bring this up at the meeting. I have included some questions for you to consider in terms of technological challenges that you can ask the school. Next slide. Remote learning methods. What works and what doesn't? I've included a list of potential methods your child may have experienced during distance learning. What has been successful? Which are frustrating? You'll know which ones those are. Give the team your suggestions about what they can change or what they should try. And the last bullet point I put on there was, 3 question marks. Maybe you have a better idea about what works for your child. Remember, you're the expert. Communication between home and school. Is it enough? Is it too much? Please request the changes to that. If you prefer emails to phone calls, ask for that. If you want weekly emails as opposed to daily emails because you're just being overwhelmed, ask for that. In terms of revisions to the remote learning plan, write down your thoughts beforehand so you're not struggling to find your words. These meetings, these PPT meetings, can be intimidating. And this might be your very first time running a PPT meeting. That can make anyone anxious. I have found that being prepared greatly reduces any anxiety. So have notes to guide you. Next slide. Okay. The next 2 slides are actually pages 4 and 5 of the IEP. If you ever need to revise goals and objectives in the IEP, the first thing you have to do is revise these pages. That's the procedure. IDEA is very procedural, and so this is what you would have to do. At the top of the page, there's a box that says Parent Input and Concerns. I am going to show you how to fill this out. The next section of this page is for the entire team, the entire PPT, to fill out. You are a member of that team. The most important area of this page is the third column, the concerns and needs requiring specialized instruction column. Every concern that is listed in this column will get a goal or objective to address that concern or need. That's why this is so important. Don't ask for more speech. Give more areas of concern that will require more speech, if that makes sense. Next slide. This is page 5 of the IEP, just a continuation of the present levels. Next slide. Okay, here is a form I created for you. It mirrors the information found on pages 4 and 5, but this time you will fill it out, listing all of your concerns in each of the areas. You have to be thorough. Once it is all filled in, you can send it to the school team a couple of days before the PPT meeting so everyone has a copy. And this is because you'll be doing this through distance, either a virtual PPT or maybe by phone. So send it to them in advance. Next slide. These are the other areas from the IEP. So this mirrors page 5 of the IEP. Next slide. Okay, here is a sample of how I might fill out the form. By fleshing out all of the areas of concern, you stand a better chance of getting a more robust IEP. And you'll notice here, I've just filled out, or I've just given you some ideas about language arts, what you would fill out there. I put in that a concern might be working independently, that he needs me to sit next to him or her to get anything done in language arts because, it's really difficult working remotely. And then I've included reading skills and writing skills because that's what you would put under the language arts area. Next slide. Okay, here is the form all filled out, all of the areas that are included on the IEP. Now there's a lot here, okay? I just wanted you to have access to it. This is not a real child. We might not have all of these areas. I just wanted you to have an idea of what you might include in those areas. So how do you know what to include here? You need to know the grade level expectations, and you need to know your child's current levels based on any sort of benchmarking that the school may have done. This is where Robin's suggestion to request FERPA file, the FERPA file, comes in. You would want to know where the school last left off with your child in terms of the concepts and skills that he or she was learning. And then we also want to know, going forward, what are the grade level expectations? Where is your child in relation to what he should or she should know as a, whatever grade level she's at. Next slide, please. Okay, math resources. So the way you're going to learn what the grade level expectations are would be by going to the Common Core state standards. If you think your child needs help with math, here's a link that's going to help you find the grade level expectations. Jen, if you could click on the link. Okay, so this takes us to the Common Core state standards. Now, if we were looking at English language, we would press English language, and we would get an idea about, what particular skills your child might need under reading. But here we're going to go back to the math standards. So if you click on math standards, again, it lists them by grade. So if, Jen, if you could click on kindergarten, let's start with kindergarten, and these are the areas that they're going to work on in kindergarten. So for geometry, the kids will have to know a certain, different types of shapes. And for, numbers and operations, they're going to have to know how to count or how to add and subtract from 0 to 19. But if we go to counting and cardinality right there at the top, if you click on that, you will see that these are the expectations that in kindergarten, kids need to be able to, by the end of kindergarten, count to 100 by ones and tens. So what I would say is, if you have a child in first grade who still cannot count to 100 by ones and tens, then I think that needs to be put on your concerns, and it needs to be addressed in the IEP with a goal or an objective. Next slide. Oh, sorry, we're gonna have to get out of there. Sorry, Jen. Okay, reading and writing resources. I have included the Common Core, which we already went through. Then there's oral, we didn't really go through them, but we'll come back to that. There's oral reading fluency norms, there's a reading chart, and the Wilson scope of reading for you that will occur in the next slides. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see the Common Core. So for kindergarten, kids have to be able to understand that words are read from left to right, top to bottom, and that they are done in a page-by-page fashion. These are the skills. You would want to make sure that your child has those skills, especially if your child is older than kindergarten. And if any of these skills are absent for your child, then again, put this on the concerns. Next slide. Okay, this is the reading fluency chart. Fluency is a measure of reading accuracy and rate, how quickly they're reading, and expression. You don't want to sort of sound monotone, and you want to be able to understand the story or know that the child is understanding the story based on how he's reading it. A child should meet fluency expectations for his grade at or above the 50th percentile. If she reads below that number of correct words per minute read aloud, then it indicates a problem with reading. And generally, it indicates a problem with both decoding and comprehension. So, for example, if you have a fourth grader, and if, Jen, if you could put the cursor over to the fourth grader, and you see the percentile is the next column, so we want something 50, 75, or 90. Any of those are acceptable. And so if we have a fourth grader in the spring, we would expect that child to read fourth grade level text at 133 correct words per minute. If your child is reading significantly below that, then that's going to be a problem. And that indicates we've got a problem with decoding, we've got a problem potentially with comprehension. And so it should be noted in the parent concerns. Next page. Here is a reading correlation chart. Different schools use different reading programs. And the funny thing is, based on the information that you get, no context is provided. So in Connecticut, we tend to use Fontes and Pinnell. And if you note in the red box, Fontes and Pinnell is the 5th column. And a lot of times, the teacher will say, oh, your child is reading at a level J. And I don't know what that means. I always have to consult the chart. And when I consult this chart, I find that looking at the third column there, that a level J is the end of first grade or the beginning of second grade. Now, if my child is in the fourth grade, then I know if he's reading at a level J, that is significantly below the grade level standard. And you would want to note that on your concerns. So this is just a handy chart for you to have, so you understand what the levels are, because I found that they tend not to give the context. The next slide. This is the Wilson scope and sequence chart. Wilson is a reading program that can be used when a student has dyslexia or decoding issues. It is based on the Orton-Gillingham method, and this chart tells you all of the decoding skills a child needs to learn from kindergarten through fourth or fifth grade. Most of them need to be learned by third grade. And if your child is in the fourth grade and doesn't have some of these, skills that you find in step 1, step 2, step 3, etc., you would want to look at these and say, oh, my kid can't read multisyllabic words. And if you look at that, you'll see that multisyllabic words, certain types of multisyllabic words, should be introduced in first grade and applied in second grade and mastered by the end of second grade. So you would want to make sure that your child is able to decode certain multisyllabic words by the end of second grade. If not, put it on the concerns. Next slide. Social skills. If you have concerns about your child's social skills, I've compiled a list of some skills for you. Next slide. Social skills do not usually need to be explicitly taught. Typically, children will learn these skills through observation, but this is not the case for kids with certain disabilities. Here are some skills that a young child with a disability like autism or ADHD might find difficult. If your child does not have some of the social skills listed here, it might be appropriate to add them to your list of concerns so that he or she can get direct teaching to pick up what he hasn't learned through observation. Next slide. Here are some potential social skills for older students. Look through the list. If you recognize your child doesn't have some of these skills, perhaps consider adding them to your list. Social skills are really important. They are sort of the bedrock for employment skills. Be sure that this area is addressed comprehensively by the IEP if it is needed. Next slide. Okay, we are hearing that schools are unilaterally reducing services and service hours simply because of school closures. Robin noted this earlier. There may be a reasonable explanation, but there also may not be. They may be just using this as an opportunity to reduce services. Here is a form for you to use when you are at your PPT. On the left side of the top grid is a place for you to put the IEP services from your child's IEP, and you would find the answers to the number of hours, the setting, the group size of where your child would typically get special education hours, speech pathology hours, occupational therapy, etc. If you go to page 11 of the most current IEP, then you would want to compare that to the weekly service hours you're receiving in those same areas during the closure. If there is a big gap between the two of them, you want to have that justified for you. And so I've put a question there. If the service levels at home are reduced, please justify it. And you would, in your meeting, you would ask them to justify why it's being reduced, and you would then jot that down there where that line is. Then, in the case of severe reductions, please list the goals and objectives that the school team is deciding won't be worked upon, and you want them to name the skill or concept that is eliminated by the change in hours. So, for example, if they say the child is getting occupational therapy, and the child needs a certain degree of hand over hand assistance so that the child can work on handwriting. You would want to say, so the skill or the concept would be handwriting. And what would the barrier at home be? And really, there is no barrier. It's just a question of getting the school district to be flexible. They're asking us to be very flexible, so we're asking them to be as flexible. And maybe they would need to learn how to use, through Zoom, there is something called a whiteboard. And so the child could write on the whiteboard and practice, and the OT would see that in real time. So just knowing that there are, to use a terrible phrase, more ways to skin a cat, more than one way to skin a cat, there are more than one way to teach that particular skill or concept, and we just need to put all of our good minds together as a team to figure out how can we get this particular skill taught through remote learning. And that's basically what I have here. The final page that we have on the next slide is our resources, and the first one is Seek Connecticut, which Robin discussed with you earlier, and that particular website is keeping an up-to-date list of the most recent federal and state guidance letters. So if you have a question about education in Connecticut, that's probably a really good resource to begin with. Thank you so much. Jen, are there any questions?
Yes, and first of all, I just want to say thank you to both of you. That was very helpful. We've got some questions. Robin, the first one comes to you about FERPA production. Someone wants to know, how do they get their child's records? Who do they contact? And then what do they need to do?
That's a good question. That's an example of a question that we automatically think everyone knows and don't realize that we need to be more explicit. So I'm glad that question was asked. It's very easy to get your child's records. Under statutory law, you can get one free copy of your child's record. Hopefully nowadays your school district does not produce hard copies if you would prefer electronically like so many of us do. But you make the request, it depends on the district, but the point is it has to be a representative of the school district. I always advise parents to make a request to their principal, to a special ed administrator, and if you happen to know who in the district actually produces the records, you can make a request directly through them. As far as the form, there are many forms available online. I also have a form that I'm happy to give out to anyone that's in the format of a parent requesting the records, but you request them, and then within 10 days, you should get a copy of the records. And it includes not just the special education records, but as far as any evaluations, anything that the school district has with your child's name on it, or identification number, or your name, or your identification number should be produced.
Great, thank you for that. Jerry.
Yes.
Someone wants to know, their child gets speech and language services, but since the closure of the schools, there has been no contact with the speech and language provider, what should the parent do?
Well, as Robin noted, there are no changes. There really shouldn't be a reduction in services. The waivers were not granted for IDEA, and I cannot understand why speech services would be reduced. So I think the first thing that the parent should do is document that you've noticed that there's been a reduction, and write an email and say, dear school, it has come to my attention that, my son or my daughter is not receiving speech pathology services at the same level he or she was prior to the school closure. Can you explain or justify the reasoning behind this? And you can also say, I would like it restored. If you do, there are some kids who are not doing well with distance learning. So it really depends on what you would want.
I just want to add into that I understand, this is where I take a hard line. I understand that distance learning is really difficult, but I don't want any parent, because of that difficulty, reducing the amount of services. For instance, if it's like we're talking about speech services, they can definitely provide it. And I see we also have a question, so I'm going to go into that one too and join it through Zoom. Right? Now, if that doesn't work for your child, then I want to get back to the form that you suggested, which is you document. That's the information that you take to the PPT. You're going to say, you know what? My child can't access learning in the afternoon, and that's the only time that the speech and language provider said is available. I've asked for it to be moved in the morning when he's more attentive. You have to come up with that notes, not to help you for meetings during distance learning, but look how that will empower the parents when the child goes back to school. And you wonder why the child's not making as much progress when you find out that possibly speech and language is the last half hour of every day, when the child, from working so hard to just cope, is actual toast, by the end of the day. So parents should not agree to a reduction in services on the IEP just because the child isn't able to access it. It's up to the parent to get in touch with the school, with the team, to say, you need to come up with other ways for my child to access this service.
Great, thank you guys so much. We have another question about triennials coming up while we're on this. People want to know, if there's a triennial coming up, do IEPs get extended until the evaluation could be done in person? And there are rumors going around about teletherapy, and if either of you know if that is a viable option for triennials.
So Pearson, which is one of the major test producers, has basically given a list of tests or assessments that can be implemented remotely. There are very few assessments that are done for a triennial are by definition standardized, and the standardization is based on a normative sample of, say, 400 or 4,000 people who all got this test in a certain delivery, or was delivered a certain way to them. And based on that, they scored a certain way, and it has to, sort of go along the bell curve. And, most people score in the middle, and, then the outliers are at either end. If you give that assessment remotely, you are violating the standardization, and it doesn't you're not getting good information there. I know that as an advocate, if the school district did that, it would be the first thing I would say. You violated standardization. And to discredit that particular test. So I think you are going to have to wait. There are some that you can do, like rating scales, which are basically just questionnaires anyway, that either the parent answers or the student answers himself, just a list of questions. Like I'm trying to think of something that's on the BASC, like I can't do anything right. Do you agree? Very much, or very, this is, a thought that I have rarely, or a thought that I have all the time. That kind of a question. But the kinds of cognitive or achievement level tests, very few of them can be delivered remotely. And I think you do actually have to wait till you get back to school. However, the guidance from Betsy DeVos specifically says for a kid in preschool, that IEP will remain, and the child will be under birth to 3, even though they are older than 3, until such time that we open up.
I'm going to jump in here just to add on to that and combine with some other questions that we have. And thank you for all the questions. There are a lot of them. That is, some evaluations are being done remotely. In particular, psychiatric evaluations are being done. With my parents, we are agreeing to have those done remotely because through Zoom, the psychiatrist can observe the child, but it's not the same observation, and no one is saying that it is, as if the child came to his office. That being said, we are seeing psychiatric evaluations that are being completed that make a note of that. That this was performed distantly. I did review all the records. I did talk to the parent extensively, but I have not been able to observe the child in the classroom and face to face, which often changes a child's demeanor and performance. However, based on what I've reviewed, and then the evaluation is given. If you do have a triennial that is coming due, what you can at this time is plan for what evaluations will be done. Plan that based on the data that you have come up with, all right? As far as not just the basic cognitive and achievement testing in areas of recognized needs, such as speech and language or physical therapy, but if you, the parent, have made these observations that there are other suspected areas of disability, then certainly at the PPT meeting where you are planning for the triennial, you can request, and you will have the data to do so, for additional evaluations to be done in person. Remember, evaluations have to be done by someone who is qualified to do so. I, at this point, knowing the limited amount I know, is I am not recommending to my families that they have their child perform at home standardized tests when it's based on a norm of thousands and thousands of kids. The dog is barking, the little brother is interfering. It's not the same test conditions, and therefore I don't think the results are valid.
I just want to make a mention that we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to get to a couple of things that people are really worried about is the aspect of regression. If your child is regressing, is it a valid point to ask for more services because of distant learning? And then in general, what if your child's just regressing? What can parents do?
I think the first thing you do is you document that in an email to the school and say, I have noticed regression and here's why. Perhaps note that, the distance learning method of delivering email packets, is not enough, and perhaps a Zoom lesson would be preferable, or whatever you would think. But I think your first step is to document it, and then the second step would be to ask for a PPT meeting to discuss and potentially review and revise the IEP. Robin, I'm sure you have something more to say about that too.
Me? You addressed the regression issue. So, and I'm going to combine with some other very good questions that have come up. I believe all children are going to regress to a point, even the regular ed. All right. The fourth graders, if your child is going into fourth grade and we give them the standardized test at the beginning of the year, it wouldn't surprise anyone if scores were lower than their peer group, the fourth graders last year. They have not had the instruction by experienced teachers, and so there is going to be some regression. That being said, in addition to noting what Jerry said, we have not emphasized enough here, and I think it's important, is the parent training. Parent training is a very underutilized resource on an IEP. You can be trained and request it a couple hours a month, whatever it takes for you. If you know that your child is learning in a certain way, or you have a child that is so disabled that absolutely cannot access Zoom, and for them it's better to do paperwork or needs hand-over-hand instruction, and you don't know how to do that, for goodness sakes, you get trained on how to do it, because then your child will fall even further behind, and there's no equity. Remember, distance learning can only exist if there is equity. So I'm sorry, but I know for parents, you have to be taught how to do this, and it's because outside agencies can't come in and do it to help supplement in any way. As far as compensatory education because of regression, we don't know what is going to happen with compensatory education. You have to keep track of when your child was supposed to get services and did not. I've heard some school districts where the child is getting every service on the IEP, and we have some clients in Bridgeport that the child has not seen any schoolwork yet or received any sort of services yet, and that is a real problem. We don't know what compensatory education is going to be available during this distance period. We are recommending to everyone that you track all hours, but there is the possibility, again, with guidances, that you could have we hope not, and we were glad, like Secretary DeVos say, or the state say, you know what, for this period of distance learning, there is no comp ed at all. Because what is distance learning? We're not in school. School is closed. And that's an argument that Jerry and I and our peers, we could go on forever, on and discussing.
Okay.
Just one, two more before we have to let everybody.
Yeah. I think one other big question is going to be about ESY. How does ESY look? Will it be remote if we're not back in session? Is the length of time appropriate depending on your specific needs of child? How is ESY going to work this year with our kids?
Go ahead, Jerry.
I think that in all likelihood it will be remote. I do not foresee a reopening of the schools, prior to September, if even then. Sorry to upset parents, but I don't see it happening. I think that, the question, is that enough? It shouldn't be a cookie cutter program, one size fits all. It's based on your child. And, to the extent that it's more of the same that led to regression, with the remote learning, because you will have a sense of how remote learning, or the particular method of remote learning that they're using for your child, how that's been working from, say, March through June. You'll be able to say, if you're just going to give me more of the same, that's not good enough. And, we're going to have to, dial it up a bit, or, add more or different, or perhaps I'm going to have to access, telehealth providers who are doing the more sophisticated, say, related services through Zoom, and have different sorts of apps and software programs and things like that. So you can say, just as you would during the regular school year, where there were no closures, to say, I'm glad that he's eligible for ESY, but I'm not taking your ESY. We'll come up with something better. That's, and fight for the school district to pay for that.
Okay. Robin, do you want to add anything, or are we?
No, I won't add anything to that, but before we sign off, I do want to address, because we've had a couple of questions, and that is as far as out-of-district placements. We have some clients where the child is in an out-of-district placement, where it was recommended prior to distance learning, and there seems to be a real need during distance learning because of the regression. The first thing is that for teams that recommend out-of-district placement, those referrals are going out. The process is that when the team recognizes that they cannot provide the child with the services or placement necessary in district, and a therapeutic school is necessary, then recommendations are made to for that sort of placement. Now, what the schools are doing when you call them, they too are not in session. And the normal process is that the parent visits the school after the school has reviewed the child's records, and then the child does. Everything is being done remotely now. And while it's on hold, the out-of-district schools reviewing the packages is not on hold at all. So if you are in a district or you have an IEP where that's been recommended, do not let that wait. I think it's like first in, first out. You want to have in front of the therapeutic school your child's folder and file for them to review, to say, gosh, when school does reopen, we get a chance to have them visit. It looks like they're an eligible candidate. I think that's very important. What else was I going to say with the out-of-district placements? Will a school team, and I'm trying to be pragmatic here, if they had never recommended out-of-district placement prior to March 15th, will they do so now? No. They are going to say that they need evaluations, they need to see the child and all. So I don't think that that is going to happen at all. We have.
I wouldn't ask for it if I were a parent. I would not ask for it during closure, because, if you were to eventually go to due process over this, you would likely not be viewed favorably by, by a hearing officer. A hearing officer would probably be very sympathetic to the school and say, it was a pandemic. What did you expect?
So just to conclude, the one thing that I just want everyone to know, and the point of us doing this webinar, and we hope it's been useful, is we can't tell you when schools are going to be reopened. No one can. Although I would believe Dr. Fauci whenever he gave us his opinion. But he has said, and many learned medical providers have said, that in the fall, we should expect round 2 of the pandemic virus. And if that is the case, then it would make sense to me, if I was an administrator and I was at the top of the food chain, to say, what is the purpose of having children come back to school for a week or maybe 2 weeks and then leave again? We don't know what's going to happen. That being said, is why it's critical, and I want you all to think beyond what's going on right now and really use the tools. We'll send them to you to know exactly how your child is learning and what isn't working. And if it's not working, you have to let the school district know. You have to be able to email them on a regular basis, keep a record of every time you've contacted them. And so that if your child, because of not being able to access the education in the way it's offered, does regress more than is expected, then yes. Do I think we can fight for compensatory education? Absolutely. But not if no one knew that your child wasn't accessing and you were just like, forget it. I'm not even going to try anymore. It doesn't mean you have to try if your child can't access Zoom or video or sit in front. Very few can. But you do have to notify the school and put them on notice. My child can't access the way you're offering services now. So if you have any other questions, we would love to hear from you. I think at one of the earlier, we will send you a copy of this webinar and the chart. It's got Jerry's contact information and my own. And again, turn into Seek on Thursday nights. They have great information. There are other attorneys and advocates that present every Thursday night, and I can't remember what time it is. What time is it, Jerry?
7.
At 7 p.m. on Thursday nights. Look them up on Facebook and you will see. And you will find that all of us are collaborating. And as attorneys and advocates, we are also working with the school districts. And I know for a fact of the ones that I have in contact with, everybody is, putting in 110%. But dealing with the unknown is really hard. Thank you for listening. We certainly
Jerry and Robin, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you to all our participants.
Thank you.
This is very helpful. So thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
Have a good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night.